All right, now we are going to hit extinction. So what is extinction? Extinction refers to two things. It is one, an operation or procedure, so a training tool, if you will, where withholding reinforcement for a previously reinforced behavior will decrease that behavior. And it's also a fundamental process of behavior or an effect on behavior, where we see a decrease in previously reinforced behavior when reinforcement no longer occurs following that previously reinforced behavior. So the behavior goes away, declines, like the dinosaurs, it extinguishes or it has undergone extinction. What it does is it demonstrates the temporary effects of reinforcement, meaning that if you reinforce a behavior, train a certain behavior, if you remove that reinforcement, that behavior will decline. So an animal, or a simple example that where this can sort of contrast what we would anticipate by behavior is a lot of times we might train an animal to engage in a certain behavior, and then we, using, say, food as a reinforcer, then we stop delivering food because now the animal, quote unquote, knows what they're supposed to do. And then they stop doing it. And that can frustrate folks because it'd be like, well, they know what they're supposed to do because I previously trained it. Why don't they do it? And the answer is because you removed the reinforcement and the behavior's undergone extinction. So you can maintain certain behaviors with different kinds of reinforcers, but if you remove all reinforcers for a particular behavior, then it will decline. And it does the same just in humans. A lot of times there's just other reinforcers that help maintain certain behaviors, like social reinforcement, doing it because you want to make the other person happy or something like that. That doesn't always pass along across a variety of different types of dogs. So when a contingency terminates, basically responding no longer reliably produces a reinforcer, then you'll start to have degradation of that contingency and a degradation of responding. It does not happen just because the passage of time, meaning that extinction is not the same as forgetting. So in other words, when an animal stops responding because they're no longer receiving reinforcement for that responding, or it's no longer being reinforced, that is not the same as the animal forgetting what they were supposed to be doing. So when this comes into our odor detection dogs, if our dogs start showing a decline in showing a response to an odor, most of the time, in my experience, not always, and this isn't necessarily fact, but in my experience, a lot of the times it's because there is some type of extinction that is undergoing, meaning that their response to an odor is no longer reliably producing a reinforcer that is sufficient to maintain that response, not because that they are forgetting. And recent research has indicated that dogs have incredibly robust and strong memory for different kinds of odors, well exceeding spans of a year, indicating, and in our experience, multiple years, indicating that a dog is not just going to forget a previously trained odor. However, they might extinguish responding to that odor because they've learned that it no longer reliably produces some type of reinforcer. So if they have repeated training where they come across the odor, do not get the appropriate reinforcement, they might have or searching behavior in general, they don't come across a target odor, you might have extinction of search behavior in general, but that's not quite the same as forgetting to respond to an odor. That seems to be relatively unlikely unless we're talking about really long periods of time. But dogs might undergo a variety of kinds of extinction in which there will be a decline in behavior, not because simply the passage of time, but because they have learned that the contingency is no longer reliably producing the appropriate reinforcer to maintain that behavior. What happens at the start of extinction? So initially when extinction is starting, or there will be a temporary withdrawal of reinforcement, you'll a lot of times get repeated sort of requests, or you'll get repeated responses, what we call an extinction burst. So say, for example, your dog is starting to undergo extinction in an odor detection scenario. One example or thing that we might expect is that they might start just responding, or they might start showing a trained final response repeatedly over and over again to a variety of random things. This is an example of an extinction burst. This is an example of your dog indicating that something that it feels like the contingency is ending, or that the contingency that they are used to is changing, and they're starting to undergo extinction. And they're showing an extinction burst, or an increase of making alert responses because it seems that it is no longer producing the reinforced response. Or say, for example, the dog is making an alert response and there's no reinforcer is coming, you might see other types of behaviors that are associated with what we call the extinction burst, which might be things like whining, yelling, screaming, some type of aggressive response. They might start scratching. They might start barking, a variety of different kinds of things. We tend to see a spike in behavior, as well as some types of other types of emotional responses. So for example, going to the sort of Coke machine that I use is a fixed ratio 1 schedule, right? You put your money in, you push the button, you put your money in, you push the button, put your money in, you push the button. You get a Coke every single time, but now the Coke machine breaks and you put your money in, you push the button and no Coke comes out. You might get a bit of an extinction burst, which would be I push the button once, push it twice, push it 3 times. Maybe I put my money in again, push it 4 times, 5 times, push the reset button, push, 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 push. Then you might end up with emotionally induced responding, and at which point a lot of people end up with the Coke machine on top of them because you're shaking said Coke machine to get the Coke machine out. This is an example of an extinction burst or extinction-induced emotional behavior. So this is quite common under extinction. So if you're seeing something, that is like, that's unexpected, some type of aggressive response to a box that wasn't previously there, or that they're just showing this really big increase in false alarms, all of these kinds of things typically indicate that there's some type of extinction that is undergoing, meaning that the contingency is not based off of what they are training and it's becoming too lean. Remember, we talked about lean versus rich schedules. It's not, the reinforcer is not occurring quickly enough or often enough that it's starting to produce extinction. What's important is that with extinction, you don't necessarily want to reinforce behaviors under this extinction, types of emotionally induced responding, or under the extinction burst, because what might happen is that if you reinforce at that point, then you end up just sort of training that that perhaps a more aggressive response is required for reinforcement. You end up just shaping a more exaggerated form of a particular type of response to get that. So like, for example, if you train the dog to make some type of sit response to an odor, and now you're going to increase some duration, perhaps to a point where the dog is starting to show signs of extinction-induced emotional variability. So then they start scratching at something or biting at something, and they're like, oh no, it took too long, click, reinforce, or throw the Kong right at when that's starting to happen. Then what you've ended up training is not necessarily an increased duration, but an increased duration. And now that a new requirement, or I've shaped up a new requirement, and now the dog has to bite or kick or pull onto something, is when I then deliver the reinforcer. So sometimes during these kind of extinction situations, if you push it a little too long, you might get a more exaggerated response that you don't want, and then you accidentally reinforce it at that point, and then you've built sort of a new schedule of reinforcement that the dog has to make this more exaggerated kind of response. Or if they're undergoing extinction in the future, then they just learn that, well, if I'm not getting, the reinforcer when I'm sitting here doing this, then I need to start biting it, because then that's when I will get the reinforcer. So not reinforcing during these extinction bursts or these extinction-induced emotional behavior, it can be quite important, particularly if you don't want that behavior. On the other hand, if you're looking for that biting or you're looking for that, then it's basically an example of shaping, right? Is that you are reinforcing successive approximations, and then extinction is then sort of giving you that next response that you're looking for, and then you start reinforcing that. If you're using extinction to try and reduce a behavior, it's usually typically very useful to make sure that there's an alternative schedule of reinforcement for that behavior. So say you don't want your dog jumping up when you come home, and for example, perhaps that's maintained by a reinforcement schedule of petting your dog when they jump up, and you're like, I don't want this anymore, I'm going to stop doing that, so I'm going to put that on extinction. It's important to then provide some alternative behavior that they can access that reinforcer other than jumping up, because extinction can take a long period of time. You can get that emotionally induced responding, which would then might produce even more severe behaviors. So say, for example, I'm going to ignore my dog when they jump up. So then they decide, or extinction starts to occur, emotionally induced responding occurs, and they start grabbing my coat, right, or my jacket, and they start pulling on that, which then causes me to immediately pull the dog off. And even though it's a different kind of attention, I've now started providing attention for that. So they learned that if I'm ignoring them, not that I want that they need to do some other kind of behavior like sit or down, they learn that they need to get a more involved response by pulling on my jacket or something like that. So if I provided attention for engaging in a sit behavior, or attention for going and laying in a particular location or on a mat, then I can be providing reinforcement for a different desired behavior, and that will reduce a lot of the extinction-induced emotional responses that can occur with extinction. So for example, if a child is crying, is maintained by attention as the reinforcer. So whenever the child cries, they immediately get attention. And we're like, I don't want this anymore. This is an undesirable behavior, so I'm going to put crying on extinction. Then it's important to also provide attention for alternative behaviors in this situation. So perhaps teaching them to ask for attention, or ask to come play with me, or something like that, and reinforcing that behavior quite strongly while putting the crying on extinction will, one, make the crying extinguish much faster, but will also help avoid some of these emotional responses or side effects that come with extinction. What about resistance to extinction? So in general, all behaviors that have been reinforced for a particular type of training scenario, or in any manner for that matter, at a high rate, or all behaviors for some, for that matter, will undergo extinction. So no matter what that behavior happens to be, everything will undergo extinction, right? But some behaviors will undergo extinction at different rates. And what I mean by that is that not every behavior will show a uniform extinction pattern. So if, say, you're on a VR2 schedule, or a variable ratio 2 schedule, some behaviors after maybe, say, 10 responses without a reinforcement might extinguish. Some might go to hundreds or thousands of responses before extinguishing. Lots of different behaviors will have different rates of extinction, and that is going to depend on the individual, but there are also a couple of other factors that we will talk about. Sometimes these things will end up being things that are difficult because you want to decrease a behavior, and that would mean that this behavior is really robust to extinction effects for decreasing it. Or sometimes you actually want to build really robust behaviors that are very insensitive to extinction. So a good example of that might be search dog behaviors when they have to search in environments where there are very few targets. In those situations, we might actually want to build up behaviors that are very resistant to extinction, meaning that if there are no targets for the dog to find, so that they're not going to get that odor reinforcer for search behavior, perhaps we want some of those behaviors to be highly resistant to extinction. In contrast, some behaviors that are undesirable, like jumping up, we don't want those to be super resistant to extinction because we want to be able to extinguish those. But nonetheless, different behaviors will extinguish at different times, and different individuals will have different rates of extinction. So in general, behaviors that have been reinforced at a higher schedule of reinforcement are more resistant to extinction. And we'll talk about this, and this is what's called the behavioral momentum effect. But first, we'll also talk about what's also called the partial reinforcement effect, which is almost contradictory. And this is, intermittent schedules of reinforcement tend to lead to greater resistance to extinction. So let's talk about each of these individually, and then we'll kind of put them back together and highlight how, even though it may not initially make sense why behaviors that are reinforced more frequently are stronger, but also behaviors that are more intermittent are also stronger in terms of resistance to extinction, but it will make sense hopefully by the end of this. So first, in terms of behavioral momentum, typically richer schedules of reinforcement lead to greater resistance to change or greater resistance to extinction or any other kind of disruptors of behavior. So generally, more reinforcement, the stronger the behavior. And this comes from what we call behavioral momentum theory. And basically it follows from momentum theory in physics, and that essentially the momentum of a behavior, or how well it will sort of persist in the presence of disruptors like extinction or other kinds of things that might disrupt behavior, is going to be proportional to the amount of reinforcement that that behavior has had. So if you can think of this in a sort of physics perspective, we have two different vehicles. We have a smart car and we have an overloaded semi-truck. What you can think of is each of these vehicles is a behavior, and every time that behavior gets reinforced, you add just a little bit of mass or a bit of size, in this case, or weight to a vehicle. And you have perhaps a brand new behavior, which you just started training yesterday and is the size of a smart car. You've only added this amount of mass to your behavior because you've only reinforced it, say, maybe 100 times in a couple of training scenarios. Whereas you have another dog who's a much older dog that has been reinforced for this behavior hundreds of thousands of times over its lifetime with a really high rate of reinforcement. So they've got lots of reinforcers for this, and they've had a long history of reinforcement for this kind of behavior. So as we're sort of building each of these reinforcers, we can think of it as like, Pavlovian conditioning association of some type of discriminative stimulus in a particular context becomes a conditioned stimulus. Remember how we talked about this, that maybe searching in this environment or my training environment has a really high rate of reinforcement, so that there's going to build a very strong and robust behavior under these conditions, whereas you might have another behavior or a different dog who's only had a small history of reinforcement for this. So they're more the size of a smart car. Now, where the real test comes into behavioral momentum theory is that, is not so much how well can you perform under ideal conditions, right? Because a semi-truck and the smart car, both on the highway, can be traveling at 70 miles per hour. They function equally well in that situation. If you're just transporting one person, the smart car and the semi are both doing just fine traveling 70 miles an hour down the highway. They've both learned the behavior, they can both do the behavior. Now the question is, well, what happens when there is a disruptor, like extinction? There are no target odors to be found, or I forgot my toy, there's no toy, or there's no other kinds of reinforcers around in that environment. And that can be a substantial disruptor to behavior, and we know extinction is a disruptor to behavior. So in this example, let's say, for example, we put up a big brick wall at the end of the highway where both of these guys are going at 70 miles per hour, right? They're both traveling just fine at 70 miles per hour, but when they hit this disruptor or the brick wall, there's going to be a very big difference in the impact it's going to have to these two different kinds of vehicles, right? You definitely don't want to be riding the smart car going 70 miles an hour at the brick wall, whereas you might actually have a chance in the semi-truck because it has substantial more momentum, because it has that much longer history of reinforcement that has built up for this particular type of behavior. So behavioral momentum theory suggests that long history of reinforcement at a rich schedule of reinforcement is really important to build the strength and momentum of that behavior. But then I also mentioned that there's an important difference between at least continuous versus intermittent schedules of reinforcement. Remember, our continuous schedule of reinforcement was our FR1. And our intermittent schedules of reinforcement are going to be all of our other kinds of schedules of reinforcement. So our Coke machine is an FR1 schedule of reinforcement, whereas our slot machine is that intermittent schedule of reinforcement. It pays off occasionally. So here, if you put your money in, right, and we're putting in an extinction situation, you put your money in, you push the button, and nothing comes out, you're under extinction. Under your slot machine, you put your money in, you push the button, nothing comes out, you're under somewhat kind of extinction. Now the question is say we've broken both of these machines so they'll never pay out, which one will you extinguish faster in? Even if you've had a longer history of a high rate of reinforcement with the Coke machine versus a smaller rate of reinforcement with the slot machine, there will still be differences in resistance to extinction that will be somewhat contradictory to the behavioral momentum theory. And we think that this is likely occurs because it is more difficult to discriminate that reinforcement has stopped because you've previously produced reinforcement or previously produced responses, not always followed by reinforcement. What this means is that under intermittent schedules of reinforcement, not only are you learning the response that I respond and I get my sort of reinforcer, you are also learning that I will make responses that are not reinforced. And I will make a variety of responses that are not reinforced. So on for example, a VR4 schedule, you are learning that on average, I will make 4 responses and get reinforced. But you are also learning that I will make on average 3 responses that will not be reinforced. Whereas with the Coke machine, you are learning that on average, every time I push the button, I will get reinforced. And that every time I push the button, I will never not get reinforced, meaning that I will always expect reinforcement. So if you are working on these 2 different kinds of machines and someone nefarious goes behind and breaks this machine so that you're now under extinction, it will never pay out Coke, or someone goes behind your slot machine and breaks it so that it will never pay out any kind of money and you're now under extinction, which one will you continue to respond more on? Typically just 2 responses on the Coke machine and you have learned that things have changed, right? That this is not the normal Coke machine and that you are now undergoing extinction. Whereas on the slot machine, if you've had a long history of reinforcement, that there are on average many responses that are not reinforced, then it will take you much longer to recognize that the schedule of reinforcement has changed such that you will never get reinforced versus you won't get reinforced after every 30 or 40 responses. So although the strength of the behavior is going to be related to the number of times you've been paid out on these different kinds of machines, there's also, you've got to be able to discriminate that extinction has changed or that the contingencies have changed and you've gone from a schedule of reinforcement to extinction. So on a Coke machine, it only takes 1 response before you've recognized that something has changed or that you can discriminate that something has changed from what is the typical reinforcement situation. Whereas on the slot machine, it might take many responses before you can actually discriminate that the reinforcement contingencies have changed and you're now undergoing extinction. So there's a bit of a balance in that you need a high schedule of reinforcement to build your semi-truck versus your car, meaning that you need a long history of reinforcement under the appropriate sort of working conditions to build that momentum. But you also, when you're undergoing extinction, need to have built in some kind of intermittency such that it doesn't take just one failed response or just one failed reinforcer delivery before the animal can recognize that the contingency has changed, and an intermittent schedule of reinforcement can help build that intermittency so that the reinforcement so that change of the reinforcement schedule is not super obvious, that I wouldn't know until I've played maybe 100 times on the slot machine that anything has changed, whereas on the Coke machine it only takes 1 time. So that's where this partial reinforcement effect comes in, is that if you have learned that there are lots of non-reinforced responses in the sort of behavioral preparation, then it can take longer for extinction to come under effect because it makes it harder to discriminate between your normal schedule and a different extinction schedule. And then momentum is what helps make sure that the behavior has been built strong enough that it will maintain in different kinds of disrupting conditions. So a high schedule or a high rate of reinforcement, so you don't want to necessarily be as lean as possible, and a long history of reinforcement is important, but also making it difficult for the animal to determine the difference between whether something is extinction or not extinction can also build that resistance to extinction. In terms of experience with extinction, the more experience an animal has with extinction, the faster extinction occurs. So if you have lots and lots of repeated experience with extinction, then you will more readily discriminate when that contingency changes from all of the time to none of the time. So for example, if you have lots of experience with Coke machines that work versus Coke machines that don't work, you will, instead of putting in an extra dollar or another dollar, you'll learn, oh, Coke machine's broken. I will only make one response. And once that one response doesn't get reinforced, then I will stop because that Coke machine is broken. So the more experience you have with extinction, the more quickly that animal will learn that extinction contingency is in effect, and the faster extinction will occur. Usefully and importantly, and sometimes if it's a behavior that you're trying to purposefully extinguish, annoyingly, you get spontaneous recovery of extinguished behavior. So if you've extinguished a behavior, put it under extinction so that it will that responding has gone down to 0 levels in the presence of some type of stimulus. So if this is your dog jumping up, and every time you come home, you've put this officially under extinction, you've trained an appropriate sit response, and everything looks absolutely great. You come back the next day, the dog jumps up again. You get what's called spontaneous recovery. That is behavior that has undergone extinction will return if there's any kind of stimulus context change, and this can be just simply change of time. I trained it yesterday, I come back the next day, it's a new stimulus context situation, that behavior will occur again. But importantly, as previously mentioned, it will extinguish more quickly after repeated exposure to those contingencies, and eventually spontaneous recovery will completely go away if extinction is held for a long period of time. We can also get what is called resurgence, which is a reappearance of previously reinforced responses when a more recently reinforced response is extinguished, meaning that things that previously were extinguished might come up again if another behavior is put under extinction. There's a variety of sort of ways in which you might get reinstatement or resurgence of previously extinguished behaviors, which is basically going to be this coming back of a previously extinguished behavior because of some other kind of context change or environmental context changes. So if you have previously extinguished some behavior that you didn't like for example, scratching at a package, and then everything looks great, you change to a new context, a new working environment, maybe a new handler, or perhaps you start putting a different behavior under extinction because they start to develop some other behavior, and then all of a sudden that scratching comes back. That might feel very, very annoying, but that's actually a very typical and anticipated behavioral response that occurs under reinstatement and a resurgence or some type of regain of previously extinguished behaviors. That is all quite possible and quite expected under sort of extinction conditions. So when it comes to sort of resistance to extinction, as we talked about it, different animals can definitely have very different patterns of extinction under different contexts. And there can be important individual differences. This was a study we did a little while ago. We just built a very simple lever pressing system where the dogs can press a lever, get food, press the lever, get food. And this is the cumulative record that we were showing before. And we trained the dogs to press the lever, get the food, press the lever, get the food, press the lever, get the food. And we built it up so that they have a series of 30 cumulative lever presses at a very fast rate to get the food. They clearly learned the task and they're doing very, very well. So we have 2 dogs, Comet and Zeus here. So Comet responded with a really high rate of reinforcement. Then we set him to extinction, and he continued to respond. In fact, he responded more in extinction than of which he had ever had reinforced responses for, meaning that he only had 30 reinforced responses at the Coke machine, if you will, where he pushed the button for the Coke. He got 30 Cokes in total. But then when the machine broke, he responded over 30 times without any Cokes being delivered or any food being delivered. Where in comparison to Zeus responded about 5 times and then determined that something has changed, the reinforcement contingencies are different, and then completely stopped responding. So you can have different individual differences. They can be based off of the animal's learning history that we talked about, whether they have experience with an intermittent schedule of reinforcement or a continuous schedule of reinforcement, whether they have learned this behavior for a long time and built up that momentum with a high or rich schedule of reinforcement, or whether it's a behavior that doesn't have a very rich schedule of reinforcement behind it. These are all things that, including the individual differences, that will impact resistance to extinction. So in some cases, you want a behavior to extinguish, perhaps an active scratching response to an explosive target, or it might be a behavior that you want to build to be really robust to resistance to extinction, which might be searching an environment in which there are very few to no targets. And that is where we come up with what we call search extinction. So search extinction is, say you have a scenario. We go back to our behavior detection chain, which we previously talked about in our operant conditioning scenario, where we have a discriminative stimulus 1, right, which is the search behavior. The first behavior 1 is searching. The first reinforcer is coming across a target odor, which is then the discriminative stimulus for the next behavior, which is the trained final response, which then leads to the terminal reinforcer. Well, say, for example, you have a scenario where the dog is asked to search and is engaging in the searching behavior, but then they never come across the target odor, right? We have extinction of the discriminative stimulus search, the behavior of searching, and not receiving that reinforcer of getting access to the odor. In fact, there's a variety of different studies that have recently come out that indicate that this can be a substantial issue when dogs are searching in an operational environment with very, very few targets. Particularly, say, in a situation where you might have one context, like a training scenario or a particular area where the dogs are always trained and there's always target odors present, but then we might have a context B, for example, maybe an operational scenario in which there are very few targets, because luckily in operational scenarios, there really are very few explosives to find. So you might have a situation where you have a complete behavioral search chain in one context, but then another context can become a discriminative stimulus that indicates that the availability of the reinforcer is not available. So this would become context B, would be an S delta, indicating that target odor is not available. And context A might be an SD. So then what we get is extinction in this S delta situation, where they learn that context B is associated with extinction. And this can happen, and this has been demonstrated. There was a great paper by Gazet et al. And Goldblatt that looked at search extinction across different paths. So say, for example, we have 3 different paths here. So 3 beautiful looking different kinds of paths. Along one of the paths is loaded with different kinds of explosives, right? So along this path, we have plenty and plenty of explosives, and the dog can find lots and lots of different explosives along this area. But then when we walk them along this different path, there are very few targets along this path. After time, what you learn, or what the dog learns, is that context A is an SD for finding different explosives. Context B is an S delta, or an extinction stimulus. You start to get extinction and search behavior declines, such that when you then put an explosive along this path, there's a much lower probability of finding the target odor on this path, particularly even at a low density. But if you took the same explosive, put it on a novel path that was different from the path in which they had learned that there was very few targets, they'll still find it. So that you can have a situation where you have good responding in this novel environment, right? Because they still will respond to the odors, but that they can learn in other environments that it's basically an S delta, or that this context is an indicator that target odor is not available and that search behavior would be under extinction. That searching is not going to pay off because there are not going to be reinforcers available along this path. Whereas on a contrary path, you can have perfect performance because they have learned that it is an SD, that there are going to be targets available, right? That this context indicates that targets are available and that searching will be reinforced. And in a much similar situation, or in a similar kind of situation, or analogous situation, sorry, is what I'm looking for, would be like not bringing the toy with you on this path, but bringing the toy with you on this path. The dogs learn to discriminate that this path reinforcers are available, meaning that odor is available, right? Because that is our reinforcer for search behavior. Whereas on this path, there's no odor available for search behavior, so search behavior starts to decline, and we start to get misses. And it's not just that only one explosive is not sufficient to maintain behavior, but on a different path, you can still have good behavior. So that you can learn that certain contexts are associated with reinforcement and other contexts are associated with extinction. And if you wanted to build a more robust search on certain contexts that are less likely to extinguish, then we can think about behavioral momentum theory a little bit to help build a stronger search behavior through a longer history of reinforcement. But we can also think about how can we build in potential intermittency so that you can sort of extend or stretch how long the dog might work before they can determine that this condition is going to be under extinction, whereas the other schedule is going to be under a reinforcement contingency. But nonetheless, extinction will still occur if you had repeated and long-term exposure to not finding the target odor under a particular context situation. All right. So with that, hopefully we defined 4 different schedules of reinforcement and explained how each of these influence steady state behavior. We compared continuous and intermittent schedules in behavioral strength and momentum and resistance to extinction. So how, which schedule of reinforcement, continuous or intermittent, tends to produce more resistance to extinction, and how does the rate and behavioral momentum of a schedule of reinforcement, or how rich that schedule of reinforcement is, lead to greater resistance to extinction. Then I want you to think about, and you will argue and justify in your assignment, whether continuous or intermittent schedules might be more appropriate for certain contexts within your training and how they might be applicable. And with that, I will then post 2 different discussions, sort of research extras about some recent research that has come out of our lab that sort of relates to these topics for this module. And then this module is complete.